Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the sixth in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series that gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know the faculty at Duke University. There's no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. And while I regret that we cannot meet over breakfast this morning in Smith Warehouse at Duke University, which is our usual location for TGI FHI, I'm really delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs and also an interview with Roberto in which he describes his work. This morning, I am very pleased to introduce Roberto Dainotto, who is professor in the literature program and in Romance studies here at Duke. Broadly speaking, Roberto's work centers on notions of place and space, whether on the concept of place in regional literature, the idea of Europe, on the Southern question, as Gramsci put it, the cultural production associated with the Mafia, the place of in Vico's New Science of the Imagination, or the notion of the world in world literary studies. He is the author of 3 monographs and a number of edited volumes on such topics as Vico, most recently the very rich volume with Fred Jameson, Gramsci in the World. The objects of Roberto's work are really varied, from Thomas Hardy's novels to Montesquieu's writing on climate, from Mafia movies to D.H. Lawrence's translations, and from Heidegger to Rousseau. His first monograph, Place in Literature, Regions, Cultures, Communities, that appeared from Cornell University Press in 2000, casts a shadow on the apparently resistant notions of place as they developed both in theoretical texts from the late 20th century and also from Victorian literature through modernism to the present. He argues there that modernity, technology, and capitalism in the Victorian period provoked the simultaneous emergence of 2 antithetical responses: a revolutionary Marxist sense of history centered on class conflict and a reactionary rhetoric of place. In this work, he is particularly critical of the resurgence of regionalism in the late 20th century thought, which he sees as incorrectly claiming a resistance to nationalism, while in fact reproducing as symptom the logic of nationalism. Regionalism for him is not a literary genre, it is a depoliticized and dehistoricized way of reading that is really a misreading by which particular places are idealized into commonplaces. His second monograph, Europe in Theory, from Duke 2007, which won the inaugural Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies, explores the development of the idea of Europe from the Enlightenment onwards. He locates the shift from a longitudinal to a latitudinal discourse, repositioning Europe from an east-west to a north-south axis in the Enlightenment, and in particular in the climatological theories of Montesquieu. In The Spirit of Laws, he explains Montesquieu posited a relationship between social relations and a natural environment. The gentle Mediterranean climate engendered passivity and hedonism, and correspondingly, a despotic government. And by contrast, the frigid conditions of the North bred courage, individualism, and cooperation. Roberto shows how writers and philosophers like Madame de Stael and Hegel introduced a temporal dimension into this idea, and how all these ideas in turn were challenged by the Mediterranean scholars, who offered different conceptions of both time and place, and brought science, medicine, law, and the arts into Europe. His third monograph, on cultural representations of the Mafia, shows the movement between Sicily and the US and the production of literature and films that were shaped partly by the restrictions from 1934 on, and from 1934 onwards, on the showing of firearms, drug trafficking, and other illegal activities in American cinema, that made representation of the mafia in cinema almost impossible until its suspension in the 1960s. The shifting sympathies for the mafia emerged also in cinematic and literary technique. Recent work has been exploring notions of the global South in Southern theory, for example, but also most significantly, I think, through Antonio Gramsci's idea of the Southern question. Today, his talk is titled Sovversivismo, Gramsci on Reactionary Insurrections. Thanks very much for joining us this morning, and over to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Ranji. Thank you, Sarah, Jennifer, and the entire FHI staff. And thank you for all the Zoom participants. I see not some faces, but at least some familiar names, which is very nice. For the next 30 minutes or so, I will be looking at the development of the concept of subversivism, Sovversivismo, and I will focus on Gramsci's pre-prison journalistic writings, only very few references to the prison notebooks. So before doing that, the most difficult thing to start the screen sharing of, of my slides, and a brief preface on the use of slides. Basically, I will use them as mostly as footnotes, just to reference the bibliographical material, as you see in blue. This is just an example, but in a way, it pushes us towards our topic. It's a little article by Gramsci lamenting the censorship of a translation that they had prepared at Ordine Nuovo, a translation of Walt Whitman to a foiled European revolutionary from Leaves of Grass. The censorship because it was thought to be revolutionary propaganda. Now, to sketch as quickly as possible the context in which Gramsci starts using words such as subversive or subversivism, as we can expect, following the military defeat of the Paris Commune in 1871, many European and colonial governments, starting with the French one, presided by this gentleman for whom Flaubert had the most inelegant of epithets, were quite earnest to declare, in the words of Alain Badiou, that communism is a criminal utopia, the worker an outdated Marxist invention, the revolution a bloody orgy, and the idea of a non-parliamentary politics a despotic sacrilege. In this climate, subversive and subversivism were terms used mostly by police, prefects, and the press for the criminalization of anarchists, socialists, and communists. Here is just one example. It's from a dictionary of political ideas that Gramsci perused quite often while in prison. It's interesting that in this dictionary, revolutions seem to be a close chapter in the history of Europe. In fact, its last echo is in an entry on Haiti, and subversiveness is identified as a threat to the freedoms enshrined in the liberal states. It is then no surprise that the same groups, anarchists, socialists, would engage in a practice of linguistic reappropriation. For the Italian socialist movement in particular, sovversivismo came to mean a way of life built around democratic solidarity against police persecution. For Gramsci too, subversiveness was to be restored to its original meaning of 1789, as the positive action of a class poised to realize those very ideals of universal freedom, liberty, and equality that the bourgeoisie had once promised, only to betray them when faced with the very first obstacle called private property. As he wrote on the periodical of Turin's workers' movement, the proletariat organized in the newly born Communist Party was in fact the subversive movement of the 20th century. But those who read his writings know that everything in Gramsci's textual universe may quickly turn into its dialectical negative, often by taking an ending with the suffix ism. Like economicism is the bastardization of economic, sociologism of sociology, and even Marxism of Marx, Gramsci starts discussing Sovversivismo in an article, heavily censored, devoted to the events of August 30, 1918. On that day, Dora Kaplan, a member of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, had attempted to assassinate Vladimir Lenin. The event opened for Gramsci the opportunity for a theoretical distinction. On the one hand, revolution, understood as Lenin's organizational discipline to reappropriate state and productive apparatus for the needs of the national masses. On the other, Kaplan's Sovversivismo, which in good faith, Gramsci remarks, and this in good faith is important, in good faith fails to understand the historical function of class organization and believes that socialism means immediate peace among men, an idyllic paradise of joy and love. This point will find significant development later in the prison notebooks, where subversivism becomes conceptually contiguous to spontaneism, another of those neologisms with the suffix ism, which means to say the belief that insurgent action can transform reality without the mediation of theory, programs, tactics, alliances, and organization. All those elements that Gramsci comprises in the formula, the modern prince. Besides immediacy, what characterizes Gramsci's understanding of subversivism already in this early occurrence is its ambiguous, even equivocal political potential. Acted in good faith, Kaplan's gesture expresses a legitimate progressive claim for proletarian joy and love. Intentions notwithstanding, however, it risks to halt the revolutionary process on its tracks and even lends credit, as Gramsci remarks from Italy, to the bourgeois press depiction of Lenin as the vicious tyrant loathed by his own people. The problem is that precisely because independent from any concrete program, theory, and organization, Sovversivismo responds equally well to and can be appropriated by any political calling whatsoever. At best, subversivism expresses the symptom of a contradiction without proposing any solution. In a later formulation, it manifests itself in a purely negative and polemical form with the alpha privative and the anti. At worst, to say it with Rossana Rossanda, denunciation or protest not accompanied by a concrete proposal only carry water to the right. Which is precisely what we see happening in an article of October 1919. The previous month, Italian bestseller novelist and poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, who had popularized in Italy the wonders of Nietzsche's Wagnerian Superman, had led a coalition of Italian nationalists to occupy the city of Fiume on the Croatian border. D'Annunzio's was an act of open insurrection against the Paris Peace Conference and the Italian Parliament as well, both guilty of having declared Fiume independent territory. Naming himself its Duce, D'Annunzio proclaimed Fiume's annexation to Italy, enshrined in its charter the abolition of any discrimination based on gender, race, language, class, or religion, recognized the rights of producers having priority over those of states, and proclaimed the inalienable rights of its citizens to music and poetry. Politically equivocal indeed, the Fiume adventure was, to use an anachronism, socially liberal and economically quite reactionary, a mixture of liberal demands and nationalist chauvinism at the same time. But what really made history for Gramsci was the class composition of D'Annunzio's nationalist insurrection. Italy's middle classes, Republicans and monarchists, liberals and socialists, were largely behind the March on Fiume. The most fervent were the class-owned intellectual, futurists and college students in the front line, followed even by karateka Harukuchi Shimoi, who had come from Japan to study, I Serva Italia, the verses of Sublime Dante. D'Annunzio in short had stirred to action a class that since the times of the Wars of Independence had but exorcised the very idea of subversion. This class had now very legitimate grievances. Impoverished in the aftermath of the Great War, marginalized by the internationalization and financialization of capital, facing the reality of intellectual unemployment, and fearful of the specter of proletarianization, this class was in a state of very deep crisis. Its subversive occupation of Fiume was expression of the crisis, and certainly symptomatic of something deeply wrong in the political economy of a state that had doomed a whole class of its citizens to progressive impoverishment and its intellectuals to unemployment. But here lies the problem. Since 1911, the restless resentment of this class had not been seized by the Socialist Party, but by the political invention of a poet, Giovanni Pascoli, which another poet and novelist by the name of Enrico Corradini had turned into a political movement, National Socialism. Gramsci did lament that National Socialism was an oxymoron, that Corradini stole from and willfully distorted Marx, and that Pascoli's was just the chimera of a wannabe epic poet and popular bard. But presenting the Italian colonization of Libya as the rise of the proletarian nation against European superpowers was a promise of land and, yes, epic glory that the Italian bourgeoisie found much more irresistible than class war. During World War I, the same epic of redemption of a proletarian nation vilified by the rest of the world would form the ideological horizon of the bourgeois interventionist version of socialism that found its voice in Mussolini's direction of the socialist paper L'Avanti. And now again, in 1919, it was D'Annunzio's call to occupy Fiume that charmed the national bourgeoisie in crisis, even if that meant an act of insurrection against constituted authorities. Simply put, this was no longer the constitutional bourgeoisie of the wars of Italian independence, but one intent in destituting a whole political system. If the Constitution of 1848 and the parliamentary state of 1861 had been the instruments through which it had protected its own interests, today, writes Gramsci, the bourgeoisie tends to break up the nation, to sabotage and destroy the very economic apparatus the bourgeoisie itself had so patiently constructed. One reason for such a change of tactics was the expansion of voting rights in 1912 and 1918. What a marginal note in Notebook 3 calls subversivism from above had then become the attempt to dominate through a subversive show of force at a moment when hegemony through parliamentary rule of law was no longer possible. Class war, in this re-evaluation of all values, was acted not by the so-called fundamental classes, but by a subaltern one caught between the rock of international capital and the hard place of proletarian demands. The Fiume adventure, from this perspective, was a show of force compensating at the superstructural level, politically, militarily, and as we will see in a moment, aesthetically, what this class was losing at the structural one. The petty bourgeoisie, as Gramsci put it, had become a purely political class. No doubt, the expression purely political class is a peculiar one. If politics is the expression of economic interest, what would a purely political class express? Gramsci's answer seems the bizarre provocation of the militant journalist searching for catchphrases rather than analytical reasons. D'Annunzio's gesture, he writes, had initially a merely literary value. D'Annunzio was preparing for the adventures of a future epic poem, for a future novel of sexual psychology, and for a future collection of bulletins of war by Commander Gabriele D'Annunzio. In Italy, Gramsci insists, a literary gesture becomes social phenomenon. A literary gesture sparks civil war. A few years later, composer Adrian Leverkun and his reader Georgi Lukács would again mull over the relation between aestheticism and reactionary or fascist barbarism. And Walter Benjamin, in one of his most cited passages, referred precisely to D'Annunzio when he wrote that the masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them expression in keeping these relations unchanged. The logical outcome of fascism is an aestheticizing of political life. Well, it seems to me that rebellion as aesthetic spectacle and aesthetic spectacle as commodification of rebellion was precisely what D'Annunzio offered the petty bourgeoisie in crisis. In this sense, its subversiveness, before being a social and political phenomenon, was for Gramsci an aesthetic one. It fueled social unrest at the same time that it crafted the figure of heroic individuals valiantly struggling against the herd, of avant-gardes combating not specific property relations, but an antagonist whose nature and historical substance remain conspiratorially vague. Schooled and educated in the midst of the bygone heroic wars of independence, steeped in a culture laced with Nietzschean and Stirnerite themes of the heroic individual, the iconoclast versus the dull herd, and often without a stipend to lose, the Italian middle class, in the midst of its epochal decline, was culturally ready for D'Annunzio's art pour l'art of rebellion, was ready to say a Nietzschean yes to subversive life. I resent, therefore I am. The idea of insurgent politics as spectacle returns in the incipit of an article of 1921. Fascism has been the latest show, writes Gramsci, staged by the urban petty bourgeoisie in the theater of national political life. The end of the miserable fume adventure is its last act. Titled The Monkey People, the article was written after a period of intense hopes for a communist revolution, followed by an intensification of counter-revolutionary activity. For 2 years, between 1919 and 1920, the Italian working class had made momentous gains in Italy and had even experimented, if briefly, with self-management of occupied factories. By September 1920, however, Gramsci began to realize that the proletarian Red Guards, here photographed, were more ready for a revolution than to resist the offensive of organized manufacturers on the negotiating side, and on the military, the police and paramilitary fascist squads promising to restore law and order through street violence and intimidation. Acting as Sovversivismo with no other program than repression, the fascist squads are the monkeys that, in Gramsci's description, ape the subversive disorder brought by worker strikes. They not only supplement the state police, they replace, writes Gramsci, the authority of the law with private violence. They exercise violence chaotically, brutally, and race against the state, against capitalism, ever wider layers of the population. The end of Gramsci's sentence is intriguing. It is as if fascism, through its squads, is not only repressing the workers' movement, it is also representing an aesthetic mimesis of anti-capitalist subversivismo, and therefore channeling a potentially progressive anger and discontent for capitalism towards a fascist solution. Neither in the article on Fiume nor in The Monkey People, however, a reactionary aping of revolutionary gesture is explicitly called subversivismo, a term that so far has appeared only in the context of the misguided, but certainly not reactionary, attempted assassination of Lenin. The first time the two terms are put together in the same political sentence is in the article oxymoronically titled Reactionary Subversivism. By now, D'Annunzio, the celebrated poet of Italy, has been upstaged by a second-rate hack, the author of a romantic serial novel in 57 episodes, Benito Mussolini, who has claimed for himself a primary role as Italy's insurgent-in-chief. Once even arrested in Switzerland for incitement to strike, and while editor of the socialist paper Avanti, Mussolini always cast himself as the uncompromising revolutionary hero of an epic in which the moderate wing of the Socialist Party played the part of that fearful clay jar, to say it with a famous Italian novel, that is compelled to travel in the company of iron pots. In his fiery fast speech in Parliament, Mussolini played the part of, right, Gramsci, un inscenatore di colpi di mano, which we could translate as someone staging coup d'etat. Gramsci continues. Yesterday at the Chamber of Deputies, we witnessed the debut of the man who loves to present himself and be presented as the leader of Italian reaction, Mussolini. In debuting, Mussolini thought well to remind everybody, almost by a way of merit, of his subversive origins. The past subversiveness of the brand new reactionary contributes greatly to give shape to the character. Gramsci is correct. Mussolini was in fact a very complex narratological operation. While the brand new reactionary kept appealing to the same middle class as D'Annunzio did, the past subversiveness of the socialist maximalists could become a magnet for the disaffected elements of the working class as well. Co-opting their sovversivismo, Mussolini was creating a transversal class alliance capable not only to ape, but also to produce mass movements of reaction acted from below. Mussolini was beginning then to dominate the theater of Italian politics as a variation on D'Annunzio's theme of epic rebellion, as the figurehead of a mass revolution committed to dismantling everything so that relations of property could remain unchanged. To the superstructural disorder of political and social agitation stirred by Sovversivismo always corresponded, in Gramsci's reading, the stability of the given social structure, or at least up to a certain point, because Sovversivismo keeps developing its ambiguous political character much further into the prison notebooks. In a note relying on one of Gramsci's most consequential distinctions, the distinction between feeling and comprehending, we read, for instance, that subversivism is, and I quote, a negative rather than positive class position. The people feel that they have enemies and identify them only empirically as the so-called signori. This generic hatred, continues Gramsci, cannot be advanced as evidence of class consciousness. It is barely its first glimmer. Indeed, it is only the negative and hostile rudimentary position. Not only do the people have no precise consciousness of their own historical identity, but neither are they conscious of the historical identity and the exact limits of their enemy. And then Gramsci adds at the margin of the note, the lower classes, being historically on the defensive, cannot acquire consciousness if not through negations. Now, as a generic and rudimentary feeling of one's own class position, and as a feeling of the contradictions of the social field, Sovversivismo for Gramsci has then a progressive historical role to play. Not only can it be organized into class consciousness, but even if led to its own, or worse, seized by reactionary forces, Sovversivismo, while unable to change relations of power, often forces the ruling classes to agree to some part of the popular demands. The response to subversivism, in other words, becomes reformism, or what Gramsci calls progressive restorations, or revolutions restorations, or even passive revolutions. In this game of give and take, subversivism reconfirms above all the role of the petty bourgeoisie and of the petty intellectual organic to it. The role is that of a purely political class, especially so in the case of the rural bourgeoisie, the agricultural heartland always depended for its subsistence on subsidies and protectionist state interventions. Because in times of crisis, this economically marginal class manages to exercise control over big capital by igniting or repressing on its behalf the revolts which break in the countryside, and thus obtaining an effective participation in power, if only indirectly, as Gramsci says, by blackmail. The entire theoretical system underpinning one of the notebook's most important concepts, that of passive revolution, hinges then on the question of subversivismo. And so does the concept of subaltern classes, in the twofold sense that first, subalternity is a rebellion deprived of effective political organization. And second, subalternity is subversiveness is not the antagonistic opposition to hegemony, but its subaltern byproduct. Before the notebooks, however, Sovversivismo appears one last time in Gramsci's journalistic writings and for us today. It appears in an article published on the daily Gramsci had launched only a fortnight before. Mussolini's fasci had by now marched on the capital, devastated the headquarters of the socialist newspaper that Mussolini himself used to direct, and terrorized entire cities. Mussolini has been elected in parliament and accepted the nomination as prime minister. In Italy, he's not the only one with a subversive past and brand new reactionary credentials. He is, as the saying goes, the mere tip of an iceberg. Who were all these pseudo-revolutionaries turned reactionary? To say it with Leporello, here is abridged Gramsci's catalog. First of all, Massimo Rocca, an employee of Sonsogno Press. He translated thousands of novels by Ponson du Terrai, by Ettore Malò, Enrico Ricbur, and especially Eugène Sue. And then Gramsci goes on, Mario Gioda, the friend of Balzac-Vautrin. He must still have in his drawer a big novel about the slums of Turin, a novel like The Mysteries of Paris by Eugène Sue. This is romance, concludes Gramsci. This is the romantic environment in which the fascist soul was given form. An unbalanced fantasy, a thrill of heroic fury, a psychological restlessness that have no other ideal content than the pure affects spread in the French romantic feuilletons of 1848. When they were anarchists, writes Gramsci, they imagined the revolution as a chapter of Les Miserables. Now that they are fascists, they want to do the Prince Rudolph of the good Italian people. The historical conjuncture, hence Gramsci, has allowed this romanticism to become a ruling class, and all of Italy a serial novel. The same echo of Marx's writings on the mysteries of Paris and of the pages from the 18 Brumaire regarding the restlessness of what the French call la bohème reappeared then in the study plan opening the prison notebooks. And it should be no surprise, I hope at this point, that the communist revolutionary jailed by Mussolini would want to spend his time in prison studying serial novels. As for us, it would be a matter of conjecturing which Batman let the Joker become ruling class and the global world a reality TV. And this is the end, and these are some of the sources that I cited, although they could not be heard, the citations.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Thank you.